Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ahead of the Cloud, Co-Evolve's podcast on cloud networking, SD-WAN, and other next-generation technologies. We've got a really exciting discussion today where we wanted to talk a lot more about multi-cloud networking. And of all of the things we talk to our clients about and prospects about on a regular basis, this is probably the one that's garnering the most attention at the moment. And we've seen it really go from a side topic and cloud connectivity being a fairly straightforward piece of these enterprise networks to something that's really dominating the conversation. So when we first started deploying SD-WAN solutions, anything cloud related in terms of cloud infrastructure and so on was typically just a very basic extension of the corporate WAN. It had like IPsec tunnels or something like that. And it just stuck out at the very side and a handful of workloads might be deployed there. What's happened though since then is that there's an immense amount of focus being placed on the cloud infrastructure component. So we've seen a lot of clients move their entire data centers into the cloud. We've seen a lot of clients that are starting now to look at multi-cloud deployments where they're deploying either across multiple regions with a single cloud provider, or they're using multiple cloud providers themselves. And not just the well-known hyperscalers, but also a lot of the more enterprise-centric clouds, so IBM, Oracle, SAP, and so on. These are all part of the connectivity requirements for a lot of the clients that we're speaking to. And the whole multi-cloud aspect of that has really added a layer of complexity to the enterprise networking component of this. And we're being asked regularly, how do you deal with this challenge? How do you provide secure connectivity into and between these cloud environments? So it's a big topic. There's a lot of detail behind it. And to facilitate the discussion today, I wanted to bring somebody else into the discussion that could add value to this and really share some of their practical experience. So today I'm joined by Sudhir Sakhuja, who's been with Co-Evolve really from almost the very beginning. And Sudhir and I worked together for many years before that. And today, Sudhir heads up our North American business and plays a number of other critical roles in the team. And I thought he'd have a lot of great things to share. So Sudhir, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kiran. Pleasure to be here.
Great. No, thanks for being here, Sudhir. And I know your background, I think, really lends itself to this discussion. And maybe that's worth starting there, just explaining a bit more about your background and not just what you're doing today at Co-Evolve, but even some of the earlier pieces to that as well, and how that comes into play for what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I have over 20 years of experience and mostly focusing on the networking, wide area network, switching, firewalls. And as Kiran mentioned, I've been working with Kiran in previous employments and I've been with Co-Evolve for 7 years almost now. So here I'm responsible for P&L and growing the business of the Americas division of the Co-Evolve. And I think what's more relevant for the podcast here is that I also collaborate with our team of global technical consultants, and I'm responsible for ensuring that we're standardizing the designs, whether it is a multi-cloud design or a SD-WAN design across our global client base. So looking forward to discussion today, Kiran.
Great. No, thanks, Sudhir. So, I mean, I gave a bit of an introduction there at the beginning about multi-cloud and the networking aspect of that. You're out there very regularly talking to our global clients, talking to prospects and so on. So is that a perspective you agree with? Is this something you're seeing really starting to grow in terms of interest from these clients and also questions just around how to address some of the complexities there? Does that resonate with what you're seeing out there?
Absolutely. So going back few years, if we look at the discussions we were having with enterprise clients 10, 15 years ago, at that time they were trying to decide whether to build a private cloud or not, whether to even go to a private cloud or not. And then they started looking at, okay, whether we should do private cloud or a public cloud. And then they started looking into, okay, well, there's use for both. So why not talk about hybrid cloud? So, and now what has happened is there are multiple type of private clouds, multiple type of public clouds, and different public clouds have different strengths and weaknesses, unique aspects. So now we are, I think, in the technology optimization phase where the enterprise client is saying, okay, why just stop at one private cloud and one public cloud if I can somehow get the benefit of multiple public clouds or multiple private clouds? Then why not use that to optimize the technology and the use of the technology even more? So over the last 10, 15 years, we have seen the client start to talk about different type of clouds, and now much more prominently they're discussing the optimization of the cloud use, which is leading towards the multi-cloud use cases.
Right. No, I think that's very much the case, and we certainly hear it across all of our clients around the world, and it's amazing now to see just the different levels of progression. I mean, we still work with clients that are very much still in a single cloud or even an on-premises environment, and we've got clients at the other end of the spectrum that have literally shut down their data centers. So it's, you've got a lot of clients that are at various stages along that journey. So I think there's questions to be asked really regardless of how far down that path you are, because a lot of the challenges are the same. They just start to grow as the cloud environments get a bit more complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, we've both, I think, spent a lot of our careers building traditional, what I would call traditional networks for enterprises. And I think, you can go back many generations of technology there, where there was MPLS or even older technologies than that. But then more recently, starting to look at SD-WAN and other technologies like that. But until I would say the last few years, the center of those conversations was really around the connectivity to the branches and the users and the data centers and so on. So, what's different about building networks for the cloud versus these traditional on premises networks or on premises centric networks? What are the new things that an enterprise really needs to think about in that environment?
Well, the first and the foremost is that there is no perimeter, there is no boundary to the network anymore, especially if you're talking about multiple clouds. You're not only reaching one cloud provider network, you also potentially have to connect to multiple cloud provider networks. And also the users not necessarily sitting in one branch office anymore, given the way the businesses are operating today. So the border, both on from the end user side as well as the data center end, is kind of not there anymore. So what has changed is that you no longer necessarily can just rely on the idea that everybody is going to be sitting in the branch office and connect to a data center at a known location in your facility using a standard high quality link. So these users could be going to the APAC data center, cloud provider, EMEA, or Americas. So what has changed fundamentally in the networking designs that we're doing these days and have been doing from past few years, is you have to take that into consideration that there is no border to the network. So you need to build a foundation where the providers can connect into your network and you can connect into authorized providers, public cloud providers easily and in a secure way, in a way where the performance doesn't become a problem.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the most critical things to get right for sure. And in terms of the infrastructure that's being used to deliver these networks, if I look back to some of the early cloud deployments, I think the large telcos were one of the first out of the blocks there in terms of bringing offerings to the market to integrate things like ExpressRoute and Direct Connect and so on into their backbone networks. And it may have been expensive, but for enterprises that were already sitting on those telco backbones, it was a fairly painless way for them to extend their networks into the cloud. So, do you see the requirements around cloud networking in particular being well addressed by these traditional telcos? Or I know we certainly see some of the telco independent perspective at CoEvolve, but what's your view on that in terms of the two different flavors of getting to the cloud? The telco versus the over the top or the telco independent model, and how do you compare those?
Right. So you're right. The telcos have been bringing the cloud offerings to the market, and I think if you have a strategy where you only want to be limited to one cloud provider, in that case, most likely provided by the telco provider you're using, then that may work for you. But in most of the cases, what's happening is that people are moving towards technologies like SD-WAN, which is decoupling the need to be on a big telco provider backbone, because the SD-WAN can leverage any ISP, multiple circuits, and provide good connectivity to the cloud and also to the enterprise data centers. So what is starting to happen, we are seeing increasing level of interest with the enterprise clients, where they're not only questioning why do we need to have one cloud, they're also looking for providers and technologies and service providers where that can open up the platform to allow them to go to any provider of choice. So today it could be Azure, Microsoft, tomorrow it could be somebody else. So I'm seeing, especially in the middle market and the larger enterprise segment of the market, there is a more higher inclination to build a network that's not tied to not only just one telco provider, but also not necessarily to one cloud provider.
Okay, so you're seeing them look for flexibility kind of at both ends. They don't want to be tied
Right.
in at the their own premises end, and they don't want to be tied in at the cloud end. Okay, that's interesting. And you mentioned SD-WAN there. We've seen a lot of SD-WAN deployments, and it's really become a cornerstone of the co-evolve business. And I guess the question is, with the deployments we've seen of SD-WAN, have you seen that make building these networks into the cloud and extending them into the cloud easier than you would have done with traditional networks, or how has it impacted the design process there? Because I know that's a piece that you're pretty close to.
Right. So if we go back to the early days of SD-WAN, hardly any vendor had any integrated offering to install a virtual SD-WAN appliance, that kind of thing, into the cloud provider backbone. Now pretty much everybody have that. So what that has done is, it not only they have those offerings, they have made the automation and scripting about enabling that easier. So you can very quickly bring up a virtual instance of SD-WAN directly into the cloud provider network, Azure, AWS as an example. So now what has happened is, you no longer have to depend on creating static IPsec tunnels type connectivity or express route that could be prohibitive for a lot of users, and especially those enterprise users that are not tied to any one big telco provider backbone. That can become prohibitive or infeasible. So what's happening now is that not only you can take the SD-WAN directly into the cloud provider network, but when you do that, you basically are enhancing the connectivity and guaranteeing the SD-WAN performance extends all the way to the data center, the cloud provider data center, which can be a big plus, because one of the other thing that SD-WAN is driving at the branch end is to be able to use more cost-effective broadband circuits, one or two circuits. So sometimes those circuits, can struggle with the performance, but SD-WAN allows two circuits to, combine together and enhance the performance. Now, if that performance of SD-WAN can be extended directly into the cloud provider, in many cases it works as good as and potentially better than express routes, which is what we are seeing at a much lower cost. So definitely, I think one is driving the other, and the use case is becoming even more compelling.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like it's very embedded into some of these cloud networks as well, as you start deploying virtual SD-WAN endpoints and edges into those cloud environments. You're actually melding the two together in a way that's probably going to result in a better outcome overall. Okay, now that's a good perspective. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Um, Let me change directions a little bit. So we've sort of touched on the edges of multi-cloud here, and we've seen a lot of enterprise deployments where maybe they start with a single cloud deployment. They can look at their extension of their network into that environment. And you mentioned earlier that now we're seeing an increasing number of clients and prospects look to expand the number of cloud providers they're using. And we've written about this and spoken about this in the past. Sometimes it's by design. More often than not, it's just a fact of life for a lot of these enterprises. Different business units make different decisions on different platforms, or they make an acquisition, and that automatically overnight means they've got a deployment in another cloud provider. So what does that do to the networking requirements? So it seems like you end up with this almost any-to-any mesh that you're now having to build between these clouds and into these clouds, and back to the on-premises components. How dramatically does it add to the complexity of the enterprise network when you start to put the multi-cloud aspect into, not just the cloud networking piece itself?
It can become very complex, and in some cases can even become a showstopper. So not only the IT team now has to understand the details and the nitty-gritties of one cloud provider, they potentially have to understand the details of multiple cloud providers. If they go that path without using any other technology that is available today to help address that concern. So it becomes complex, because there could be different ways of configuring security policies, for example, different ways of optimizing the workloads, and the need for multi-cloud is going to be there. It's not going away anywhere soon, because as you mentioned, there are different reasons. Some clients just end up with multiple clouds. Some are purposely going to multi-cloud to optimize their cost, I've even had a client that wanted to go to one particular cloud provider because they specialize or are the best in one particular type of workload, the
Okay.
application workload.
Yeah.
So a lot of factors driving that multiple cloud use or multi-cloud use case, but it can become complex. So unless you have some technologies, overlay technologies that helps make it more consistent. And one of the biggest concern that I'm seeing out there is unless you have something that manages multiple clouds, is that policy, especially the security policy enforcement, oftentimes end up being inconsistent because every cloud provider has their unique ways of doing things. So it is challenging, but there are technologies out there today, thankfully, that are addressing that challenge.
Right. Yeah. No, definitely the security piece is a big concern. We may come back to that a little bit later, just to go into some more detail on it as well. And in those multi-cloud deployments, the connectivity between the clouds and how are we seeing clients take advantage of the different options there? I know obviously the lowest common denominator there is to just use internet connectivity with some form of tunneling or overlay between those. We've also recently announced a partnership with Equinix that's providing a lot of this interconnectivity between cloud providers. How do you see enterprises making the choice around these options and knowing what the right option is, or how do they match that against their requirements?
So that's another challenging point for the enterprises where personally I feel talking to the clients that they could use some help from providers like CoEvolve and similar providers. It's the challenge is that each cloud provider is focusing on their own networking aspect and they're optimizing it with very little consideration of what happens if a client has deployed multiple clouds. They need to replicate the data between the two instances and any other data transfer. So that kind of is not fully optimized between the providers, understandably so. And not only that, a lot of cloud providers would charge you, depending on the volume, could be very high amount, dollar amount, taking the data out. So egress of the data. So that could also become a big challenge for the enterprises who are going to adopt this multi-cloud technology. So what we are seeing is that providers like CoEvolve, ourselves, there are other options out there. As you, Kiran, mentioned, we partnered with Equinix, so we can build parallel high quality backbone and have routing policies in the system network where inter cloud data transfer happens outside of the provider cloud network, and not only you get the performance benefit but also cost benefits of doing those data transfers. So it kind of go hand in hand. I think that is a big challenge, though. Yes, the connection between multiple cloud providers.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point there about some of the egress charges and the usage based billing model. That's something that I've seen clients just express a lot of surprise around, because if we look at how traditional enterprise networks were procured and then managed over their life cycle, it was a very predictable pricing model. You'd buy a circuit for X $1,000 a month, and maybe you weren't crazy about the cost of it, but you knew how much it would cost from one month to the next. And networks were sort of the sum of all of those fixed cost components. And I think the cloud has really created a bit of sticker shock for some enterprises where it really is very variable depending on how
Mm-hmm.
much network traffic they're sending between those regions. So is that something that you see some of these alternative backbone options providing some mitigation around and being able to provide some of this more predictable billing? Are you seeing clients express
Correct.
interest in those benefits as well?
Absolutely. So you get the benefit of this alternate backbone, connecting the clouds of
Yeah.
that solution. You get multiple benefits. Two most prominent benefits are more consistent end-to-end performance because those connectivity have been planned and optimized to connect to different cloud providers, and also no variable billing and cost effective per Mbps or MB of data transferred.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Um, so one of the sort of favorite topics for co-evolve obviously is managed services and providing a level of value over and above the infrastructure itself. And it feels to me that multi-cloud networking and the whole concept of building and then managing these networks that sit outside of the traditional network perimeters you mentioned earlier, that seems to be just shaking up the managed services model quite a bit. So I guess the provocative question at the beginning is there still a need for managed services in this model? So what can enterprises consume in terms of managed services, and how is that different in a cloud-centric network versus an on-premise network purely from a managed service perspective?
Right. So no, that's a great question, and I would say first and foremost, there are multiple options out there, and a lot of enterprises may not be aware of all the options that could be a better fit for their use case. So one of the benefit the MSP brings is the experience in doing this, and some of the technologies that we were talking about to interconnect different cloud providers and to abstract the cloud orchestration so that it doesn't matter whether your workload is sitting at AWS or Azure. Some of those technologies are still evolving. So, and I think one of the biggest benefit that MSP brings along with the traditional standard benefits is the awareness of the options that are available. And so our solution can be designed to meet an enterprise use case or requirements. Now, there are other benefits when you're talking about a backbone interconnecting different cloud providers. You're talking about a highly critical service. So troubleshooting with multiple providers, unless you understand multiple providers or have created an abstraction layer on top of it, can be very challenging. So that's another benefit where the expertise of the MSP could come into play. And then I'd also say that the global reach of the MSP. So oftentimes these use cases, you have data centers in different countries, different regions. So you need not only just one person who understands in your team, you need army of people, technical people who can on a 24/7 be ready to optimize or support any incident in those environments. So definitely I see wherever there is some complexity, I think there is a big role for the expertise that MSPs can bring, because the MSP kind of package and standardize years and multiple hours of their learning into a packageable format that the enterprise consumer can easily consume and benefit in a cost-effective way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of enterprises, when they start moving towards some of these next generation technologies, so they deploy SD-WAN, for example, they build those networks out into the cloud, I think a lot of them are surprised at how much traditional networking is still involved. You might have some next generation fancy overlay protocol sitting in the middle, but when that network needs to talk to the outside world, you're still using BGP in a lot of these environments. You're still using OSPF back into your data center, and there's a lot of those enterprise networking skill sets that are still really applicable here. And that's even true in the cloud world as well, to connecting into some of these cloud provider networks. You're still using those, you could call them legacy routing protocols or more traditional routing protocols. So I do think there's a need somewhere for a lot of that same skill set. In addition to the packaging and abstracting that you mentioned, you need some of the just the raw networking talent and skill set, and either that comes from inside the enterprises team themselves, or it's coming from external expertise, or a combination of the above. But yeah, that seems to come as a surprise still to enterprises, that all that still exists in this world.
Correct. And we both know that one-click deployment in the networking world, especially in the multi-cloud, is not really a one-click deployment. So there are a lot of things that go behind that in planning phase, even if it is literally a one-click, but you can't just click without a lot of design work and planning for that. So that's where I think we come
very
in.
true. Yeah. And do you see the cloud providers themselves adding value here from a service perspective, or do you see their role just as more the facilitators or the pipes essentially that are joining these different components together? Is there anything that they are doing in the cloud layer to add value here from this perspective?
Yeah, so I think what I find interesting is that over the last 2 years, all the major cloud providers, they themselves have realized that multi-cloud is here to stay, I think.
Yeah.
Because if I see at what they're doing is they are allowing like VMware hypervisor to run in AWS, Azure, and multiple clouds, with the whole idea being that from the enterprise perspective, they can get a similar environment to manage no matter which cloud provider the infrastructure is built on.
Yeah.
So they started doing that a couple of years ago, and that I think basically tells us that even they themselves are acknowledging that multi-cloud is going to stay here. Now, on the other end, some of the technologies that Google brought in, like Kubernetes, that's also kind of leaning in that direction. So most of our large enterprise clients, they're all, actively deploying Kubernetes-based workloads. So one of the biggest benefit of Kubernetes workload is not necessarily just only it packages everything neatly, but I think the biggest benefit you can move that Kubernetes workload seamlessly or easily from one cloud provider to another. So those kind of technologies, I think, are becoming very prominent now, especially in the mid and large enterprise. And so I think cloud providers are playing a big role in not only cloud adoption, but also enabling multi-cloud use cases.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. And I guess if you take all of those different factors, then so when you're out there representing what's really a specialist MSP like CoEvolve, and you're comparing that to a do-it-yourself approach to the client, it sounds like a big part of the value that an MSP like CoEvolve can provide is that awareness of all of these different components. It's not just coming in talking about a specific product, but it's the whole ecosystem and being able to wrap that up into a cohesive story. Is that really how you're typically approaching those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenge that I come across is that enterprises don't know what all options they have. So and what's the best way to bring them all together? So CoEvolve over the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time helping clients do this, and we have our standard designs and packages where we have gone through multiple use cases and identified what's the best way to connect one cloud provider to another as an example, and also which cloud workloads are good for what kind of reasons. So
Yes.
we can help enterprise clients not only with their awareness but also optimize the design that they're thinking. And sometimes, if it's a use case where multi-cloud doesn't make sense, we would tell them, right? So I
Yep.
mean, probably better off with a single cloud provider and avoid, at least for now, going to multiple clouds. So I think that's the kind of expertise that we bring in the design phase, and then the management phase. The complexity that we handle and shield the client from managing those multiple providers is also a key element.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And I think related to that, how are you seeing the skill sets of the team that's providing these managed services evolving? Are you starting to see things like certifications and training structures around some more cloud-centric networking become part of that? And you're obviously heavily involved with the technical standards across our team, but are you seeing an interest or a growing interest in people wanting to learn more of these cloud-oriented skill sets so they can add that type of value?
Absolutely. So most of the cloud providers have, I think, they've started to come out, and some have been coming out for a while with the training segments, specifically focusing on the cloud networking aspect. So
Yeah.
the cloud network is the new network. I
Yeah.
mean, whether
Yeah.
you're forced to go that way because some M&A activity or some of the other reasons we mentioned earlier, I think it's very important for all the techies, the network people especially, to have good awareness and understanding of the cloud networking, at least to the extent that they know what options could potentially exist in each area.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Definitely. So, I mean, looking forward a bit, I feel like we're still in the fairly early stages of multi-cloud deployments. There's still a lot of fragmentation here in terms of point solutions addressing parts of the end-to-end connectivity and management and analytics and everything else. So, what are your thoughts on where cloud networking, in particular, and multi-cloud networking, is likely to go over the next few years? And maybe in particular, are there big use cases that you don't think are being well solved yet, or not easily available as an off-the-shelf offering? Where do you see this going?
Right. So I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. It's still a little bit complex because all these products that we talked about, abstracting multiple clouds and interconnecting all those clouds, they're still in the early phases of product maturity. So it is still a little bit complex. So, and as a result, the price, I think, can be sometimes a little bit cost prohibitive, especially for the smaller segment of the enterprise client, revenue wise. So where I think this is going to go, so I do think multi-cloud is going to stay. It's not going to die. And the biggest reason I think that is not only it's going to stay, I think if you look at a lot of use cases like the edge compute. So there is a growing interest, even in small and medium enterprises, to have some kind of edge compute infrastructure. If they're doing some kind of IoT or some kind of local analysis, video feed analysis, like an example of a small casino comes to my mind. So they need a lot of edge compute sitting on their premise, so they can identify behaviors that are not legal and things like that, and they need to act on it very quickly. So all those use cases, I think, is only going to increase not only the type of multiple cloud providers the enterprise has to work with, but also increase the number of data centers or data centers in the box that the enterprise has to manage. And that data center could be like a cloud edge, could be an on-premise data center, or could be a standard cloud offering like AWS and Azure sitting in the cloud. So I think it's going to scale up horizontally, and hopefully, I think, as the technology to bring everything together matures, the price is going to be at a level where not only medium and big enterprise can afford, but also smaller end of the enterprises can.
Right. And I think, so your point then, I guess, is that it's a commercial thing, but maybe also a packaging consideration for this to be more accessible to some of the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, so that they can consume these services more easily. Is that essentially the point there? Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point, definitely. Okay, well, I mean, this has been a really great discussion today, and you've brought an incredibly valuable perspective to this, Sudhir. So, really appreciate you taking the time to do this. As we said, it's an interesting topic to almost every one of our clients and prospects that we're talking to. So, I wanted to take the time to walk through it in a bit more detail, and hopefully our listeners found this valuable. So, we'll wrap it up there for today. But thanks again for joining me, Sudhir, and we'll look forward to speaking soon. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting, Kiran, and your questions were very insightful. So thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.